Before I introduce today's guest, I want to tell you about our sponsor, thegreatcoursesplus.com. The Great Courses is, of course, the teaching company's Great Courses, of which I've been a longtime fan and user. And now they have an app. You just download the free app on your phone, you tap on it, and you go to whatever course you're interested in listening to. This is my latest one. I've been going through Native Peoples of North America. This is lecture number 17 I'm up to now by Daniel Cobb, PhD. The beautiful thing about the Great Courses Plus app is that you can skip around with lectures. You don't have to just kind of grind through lecture after lecture for an entire course if you decide you don't want to listen to the whole thing. This particular course is 24 lectures, and so like most courses, I probably won't listen to every single lecture. But this one I've been thinking about because of the whole national conversation on reparations for African Americans, and if we go that route, then Native Americans certainly have a case to be made. And this history is really disturbing. It's difficult to listen to because it's reality of what happened here in North America. So I think it's the kind of thing where knowledge is good before we make political decisions. But anyway, that's not the point of this. I just want to encourage you to log on to thegreatcoursesplus.com/salon, and then you get a free trial as a listener to my podcast. Thegreatcoursesplus.com/salon, and you get a free trial. It's great. So give it a shot, give it a try. When you're driving, working out, doing chores, walking, hiking, whatever, it's a great way to consume content. All right. Thanks for listening. My guest today, Greg Lukianoff, with his book, The Coddling of the American Mind, How Good Intentions and Bad Ideas Are Setting Up a Generation for Failure. I hosted Jonathan Haidt on the podcast when the book first came out, and so it was great to have his co-author, Greg Lukianoff, whose work I've followed for many years because he's one of the premier free speech defendants of our generation, and his work at FIRE is super important. Let me give you his biography. He is the president and CEO of the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, FIRE, Foundation for Individual Rights in Education. It's a nonprofit. I support it. I recommend you support it as well. He's a graduate of American University and Stanford Law School. He specializes in free speech and First Amendment issues in higher education. In addition to The Coddling of the American Mind, he's the author of Unlearning Liberty, Campus Censorship and the End of American Debate. And his previous book was Freedom from Speech. He's also a filmmaker. And his new film, which we're also talking about toward the end of this podcast, is Mighty Ira, about Ira Glassner, the president of the ACLU for decades and really a great champion of the First Amendment, free speech issues against conservatives at the time. Now it's sort of weird that conservatives are defending free speech against liberal censoriousness, and we get into that as well. So we also talking about the difference between the First Amendment legal issues about free speech versus, say, campus-wide issues on who can say what to when, to whom and when, versus corporate issues about employees speaking their minds and what's the right time and place for that. And then we give a little brief history of free speech in the 20th century and why it's never a given. It's always something you have to fight for. And in any case, Greg is a really thoughtful, interesting guy on these issues, so I was very glad to have him. So with that, I give you Greg Lukianoff. I missed you on the podcast when your book came out, just to reintroduce it to our audience, The Coddling of the American Mind, How Good Intentions and Bad Ideas Are Setting Up a Generation for Failure, with your co-author, Jonathan Haidt, who was in town at Chapman University, where I teach, when the book came out. So I just did a podcast there in my class with him. And actually, my students were the perfect audience for your book, because these are Gen Xers, and they're, 18 years old, right out of high school. And they have all sorts of sort of what.
Do you mean Gen Z?
Yeah, Gen Z. iGen. Yeah, Gen Z. Sorry.
Yeah, I'm a Gen Xer, man.
Yeah, that's right. No, that's right. Yeah, I got to get those straight. I'm a baby boomer, so you're just a kid.
My dad was born in 1926, and I'm not even totally sure what generation that makes.
Well, the silent generation, I think, right?
I think so, but it might be. I think it's slightly before that. But he is Year of the Tiger, just like me.
So you guys talk about gene Twangy's book on iGen, which tracks those kind of generational changes back to the early 20th century. And it's an interesting area of study that we might discuss. That is to say, to what extent can you really kind of pigeonhole a block of time of people born in that?
Yeah.
And you can sort of identify, interviews by people like John Wayne. Well, what do you expect? He was born in 1920, so he's going to say things about blacks and Mexicans and women and Indians and whatever that, you and I wouldn't say. And so there are some generalizations you can make. And so let's start there. I do want to talk about your new movie. We'll get to that. But sort of as an update of your book,
right.
You guys talk about those generational differences. So the book's been out for more than a year now. How is that data held up, those kind of generalizations?
Well, I have a blog called Eternally Radical Idea, which is a reference to free speech, because I think in every generation it remains radical. And I'm doing an update of all the data in Coddling the American Mind, and I've been doing it since the spring, and I'm not nearly done with it. But one of the most important ones we did was updating the data on anxiety and depression. And the trends that we thought might be coming subtly in 2015 have continued to just skyrocket, and this is all pre-COVID stuff. Like it was going in the wrong direction in terms of suicide, in terms of self-harm, in terms of self-reports, on both the ones you can fake and the ones you can't, essentially. So unfortunately, that situation is getting worse. The debate about whether or not social media is to blame, it continues to be interesting. I just we haven't found a good contender for another theory about why the generational divergence is so stark, and that's one of the things that makes this one of the things that makes this study so compelling is that a lot of times generational divides they work kind of like a Gaussian distribution, like that essentially kind of like you sort of ease into one, and then that at some point you can really see the differences. This one's extremely sharp. The discontinuity between people born before 1995 and people born after is really it pops up in all the data, and it was something that we saw on campus back in 2013, 2014, where it was just like this is very different than it was 6 months ago. All of a sudden, so far the data is holding up. Really interesting additions from people like Kate Julian, who wrote this really cool piece about how anxious parents contribute to this. It was a cover story in the Atlantic that really goes very deep on that.
So just to nail the details of this, so the problem to be explained is this spike in depression, anxiety, and suicidal ideation, particularly among girls more than boys, or young women versus young men. So you're talking about like a threefold increase all of a sudden, like around 2015 or so?
Doubling.
A doubling.
At its worst, it was a doubling, which is surely bad enough. The one surprise that came after the book came out was a really dramatic spike in suicides for young men, which was not the kind of discontinuity you'd want to see. That kind of came as a surprise when we looked into the data, and it was very sharp in the year after the book came out. So the two things we're trying to explain in the book is, one, it all started from observing, these demands for trigger warnings and speech repression on campus that was very different than even just a couple of years before, coming from students who were usually pretty good on speech. And then, but what really made it characteristic, and interesting to me in Haidt, was the fact that the arguments were primarily medicalized, basically saying that it would be harmful, traumatic to me in a very literal sense to have that speaker here. And that's how we started going down this rabbit hole. But it's been interesting, I got to tell you. Like the more we looked into what was so different about the generation coming in 2013, 2014, it just got deeper and more interesting with every additional step.
So the causal vectors you're looking at are variables. So there's general screen time, and then what you're doing on the screen. So social media, Facebook, Instagram, whatever, fear of missing out, fear of being left out. Now,
all those phenomena.
Wasn't there a study that did not replicate those initial studies that Jean Twenge had published before your book?
Yes, there's definitely some controversy over that in the data. Definitely, that's one of the things about being a co-author is when it comes to that stuff. I definitely defer largely to Haidt, but from and that's also one of the things that I always point out is that we didn't rely just on screen time. We definitely think that we talked about 6 different causal vectors, whereas Twenge mostly focuses on social media. We actually looked into anxious parenting, lack of free time, lack of play. And actually, I think the parenting aspect is going deeper. And I'm going to add in the next installment of Catching Up with Coddling, my plan is to actually add a 7th causal thread, which is, I don't love saying income inequality because like the term itself makes it sound like in an ideal world everybody would be paid exactly the same, but class stratification.
Right. So,
I think is when we address it in the book, but I don't think we addressed it enough. The idea that getting little Timmy into Princeton will mean that they're kind of set from that point on is it's dramatic.
Yeah. Okay. So as we drill down into those variables, there's the sort of coddling, parenting, or whatever you called it, where so these would be parents my age, right? Parents that, well, no, I guess your age more. I guess be about my age, my generation, baby boomers, and your generation, raising their kids in the late 90s, early 2000s, during the height of sort of this parenting fear of kidnapping and dangerous playgrounds and dangerous sports like dodgeball and things like that. So there's just sort of hyper parenting. How has that held up?
And also an emphasis on things like bullying, which kind of pervades the discussion too. It was interesting. We got a lot of people saying that we should have focused more on the anti-bullying efforts leading to sort of a suspicion of free speech. We looked into that pretty intensely, and although it makes sense, we didn't see that much evidence of it.
Yeah. Right. So then the question be would why are those parents, you and me, acting raising children differently than our parents did?
Yeah. Well, I do think that's the reason why I'm adding the 7th causal thread, because I do think that a society that's come to believe that there's sort of these magic institutions that if you can get your kids into, they will stay in the upper classes, and that you don't really want to be in the American middle class, let alone lower than that, under the current circumstances. I think that does drive people crazy to a degree. But talking to Kate Julian, she actually, I think to a degree, sort of, she's a writer for The Atlantic. She writes wonderful stuff. She did something on the sex recession, which was such a good read. But talking to Kate Julian, one thing that she pointed out that I thought was interesting was that the kids who have the highest rates of anxiety and depression from like the Menlo Parks, from like the Palo Altos, and those same kids with absolutely every single identical demographic don't have those symptoms, at least as pronounced, if they're not in a place like Menlo Park or Palo Alto. That essentially, if you grew up like me, where the idea was, I'm not sure I'm going to go to college, it's kind of a theoretical thing, and nobody was like gunning to get in anywhere, let alone a fancy school. Apparently I had literally zero stress about that because it was like all gravy as far as I was concerned.
Yeah, that's right. I was in high school in 70, 71, 72. I took the SAT in 71, and I think that was one of the first years it was introduced. And it was like no preparation. It was like, so next Saturday you're taking this test. Oh, okay, what is that? It's this aptitude. Okay, I just walk in, I have no idea even what's going to happen. So of course, I didn't get that great a score, and I ended up going to a community college. My parents didn't go to college at all, and it was something I barely even thought about in high school. And so of course my daughter, I sent her off to, she was born in 91, so I sent her off to SAT prep, class, and we got the books and all that stuff, and of course she's going to college. I mean, that's just a given, and it's just such a different thing. But and I can see where parents would get anxious about that, although I never was, because I turned out okay, and I went to a community college, just a nothing school. Yeah. And
I went to the first college I visited.
You did? Right.
I visited American University. I was like, this looks nice. They show movies. But I also knew it did international relations and journalism, which I was interested in. They gave me a package that looked like a free ride to my uneducated eyes. And I was like, sure, I'll be your last early admission. So it was funny going. I went to Stanford for law school, and I got to see what the atmosphere was like even then for people who were really gunning for the fancies.
Yes, right.
Which is the name of my next book, by the way.
The fancies?
Gunning
for
the
fancies.
I'm just kidding. I just
that's not bad though. I mean,
kind of
I guess that's what's behind.
That's
what's
bad.
behind the whole college entrance scandal was, parents just obsessing about got to go to USC or UCLA or else.
Yeah,
I'm a failed parent. Whereas the kids, some of these kids, they didn't even know their parents were doing this or just didn't realize how important that their parents thought it was. Yeah, I can see that as an issue. Well, one of my pet projects is how lives turn out. Yeah, and to what extent luck plays a role, and genes, upbringing, environment, and surely having parents that read a lot of books on the shelves at home, and all that stuff makes a difference.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't think it makes as big a difference as a lot of people think, and I think that's your point, right? It's parents obsessing about. Mm-hmm. I want my kid to go to Harvard or one of the Ivies. Therefore, they have to go to a private high school. Therefore, they have to go to a private super, middle school, and all the way down to the pre-Harvard preschool or whatever it would be called.
Yeah.
And then you're obsessing about that when your kid is 4. Well, I have a 4-year-old son now, and I'm not worried about it at all, because as far as I know, when you look at kids and where they are at, say, 7th grade. They all pretty much catch up, regardless of which grammar school they went to or preschool or whatever, right?
Yeah. Well, yeah, and that's something that was also great from talking to Kate Julian. I keep referencing this interview that I did with her, which we're going to be doing a podcast about on our, so to speak, podcast. But she pointed out also the fact that one of the things that might be increasing anxiety and depression is sorting. That essentially, like homophily happens, and like. So you might have seen a massive increase in the number of equally anxious people finding each other at fancy schools, which I hadn't given a lot of thought to.
Yeah. Well, okay, so surely some of that matters, but the role of luck, and here I don't mean just you lucked out and got a good teacher rather than a crappy teacher, and that
cosmic luck. Yeah.
That makes a difference, but also just the luck,
Sure.
The luck of what personality or temperament you have, in terms of having a high need of achievement where you're driven to be successful. Some people are just born that way and others aren't. And I don't think we need to evaluate it in any way, because it's not to say that making a lot of money or having a particular kind of job makes for a better life. I mean, in many ways, I've scaled back my personal ambitions in order to enjoy riding my bike every day for a couple hours and playing with my kid and stuff like that. And to me, that's a higher quality life. And, when I look at what it takes to be a CEO of a major corporation, a Fortune 500 company, I would not want that life. I mean, even when I, as a professor, I had some professor friends that wanted to be deans, an administrator. And I'm like, have you lost your mind? Those guys, they have to work. That's like a real job. I mean, they have suit and ties. They're there like 8 to 5. I mean, the whole point of being a professor is we didn't have to do that.
Yeah, I just actually finished the Meritocracy Trap by Daniel Markovits.
Right.
He's a Yale professor, and I'm a little, so on some of the thesis and some of the argument. But the idea that people who go to the Yales and Stanfords and the Harvards go into this sort of horrible maw of unbelievable work schedules and that kind of stuff. Is absolutely true, and I can attest to it. I did object a little bit to making it sound like we had no choice, given that I went to law school, had that in front of me, and was like, no, I'd rather do a nonprofit, for my career. So the fact that I know from personal experience you can actually avoid that trap makes me a little bit less feeling like, oh, these poor angels.
Yeah, I was at Pepperdine. I took a class in anatomy and physiology, and most of the students in there were pre-med. And I thought, oh boy, I do not want to be like these guys. I mean, they was just obsessively working. It's like, All right, because they felt they had to do that to get into med school. And then,
Yeah.
of course, you get into med school and
Yeah.
you work 80 hours a week, and then you're a post med or whatever, then an intern, and it's 80 hours a week, and it's like this does not seem like a high quality life, and so
No, and but at least in their defense, my sister's a surgeon. Doctors save people.
Well, yes, of course.
I joke that I had to.
I know. Yeah.
I had to become a lawyer because there are so many other bad lawyers, making havoc. I defend my when people crack lawyer jokes to me. I'm kind of, and they think, "Oh, I want to offend you," and I'm like, "No, I'm with you."
Right.
I'm skeptical of my people too.
Yeah. So back to the social media thing, this become all the rage now.
Sure.
Since the 2016 election, the Russians, hacked the election. Well, how did they do that? Well, they manipulated social media through bots. So what? I mean, I have free will. I can turn it off. I can read print newspaper, which I do. I don't have to get my news from Facebook, or I can have 20 sources online for news sources. And but I'm in the minority here. I mean, there's this Netflix documentary everybody's talking about, The Social Dilemma, with Tristan Harris and some of these other now ex-employees of Facebook and Instagram and Twitter and so on, and kind of like pulling back the curtain to show us all the manipulative tricks that they use to keep our attention. But it's presented as if they invented this idea. And it's like, have you watched Mad Men? What people were doing in the 1950s to get us to smoke cigarettes and drink whiskey and whatever. I mean, there's nothing new about, trying to grab customers' attention to get them to buy your product over and over and over again. This is, normal. So but the other thing that bothers me about it is that it treats individuals as if we are automata without choice, and that we're like like the ball in the pinball game, just bouncing around at the whims of these programmers. And I think it puts too much emphasis on their power. And finally, what really bothered me about this is these guys were talking like as if they were J. Robert Oppenheimer, self-flagellating about inventing nuclear weapons. Now I have known sin. Yeah. The destroyer of death.
Right. I have become Vishnu.
Yeah, I've become Vishnu. It's like, dude, you were creating the like button on Facebook.
It's a little over the top, dude.
Yeah, the like button on Facebook is not nuclear weapons.
Yeah, you made it easier for me to crack jokes. But I definitely am in the camp of concern, and I do think that people go too far in it, and they do think that we are automata. But I do think that we're adjusting to a very strange new world when it comes to social media, and one that I do think, foreign powers trying to manipulate it in their favor. Well, sure, are we probably doing the exact same thing? Sure, and I do think that the first it's like the first generation in a whole new village, and we haven't adapted the norms to actually live with it in a sensible way. But as far as social science experiments that I do put a lot of credence in, and I'll see how well they hold up, but there have been a lot of them, are group polarization experiments. And that's one of and that essentially if you're surrounded by people who agree with you, you tend to become more radicalized in that position, both due to how many arguments you get on that side, which is Cass Sunstein's great contribution to that, but also Haidt, my co-author, that tribal switch kind of goes off. So I do think that social media, or at least it's my explanation for something that hyper accelerated partisan polarization. And I still do think that, particularly for girls, my go-to explanation that social media is the absolute worst possible thing that high school girls could actually ever have access to in terms of like the way they combat with each other. So I don't think it's the end of the world, but I do think it's sometimes when people will make fun of us, and sort of lampoon our theory, they'll make I wish I could find this tweet, but someone said it's like, oh yeah, people said the same things about the printing press, that it was so dangerous, and I'm like. Yeah. It led to hundreds of years of religious warfare. Like it was the defining, disruptive technology. I think it was overall worth it in the end to have the printing press. But yeah, there's going to be some growing pains.
Yeah. So maybe my initial example of, say, Russian bots manipulating how we perceive presidential candidates, maybe that's different than teenage girls on Facebook.
Yeah, no, I do think that my brother, he's very concerned. He's a stats guy, and he's concerned about how much you can manipulate the environment or around people, and are people easily led or influenced? Yeah, I do wonder. This is actually a tension between my First Amendment work and what I think would be better for society. Anonymity is something I'm not as much of a booster of when it comes to things like this, because I think that if you had sort of the equivalent of Twitter, but it was tied to everybody's actual identity, a lot of the stuff that we're really concerned about would go away. It would be really very, at least easily possible to do bots and that kind of stuff. And I think that the quality of the discourse would really improve. Meanwhile, though, like I do have a little bit of a Twitter booster in me, a social media booster. I'm like, this is the biggest, weirdest experiment in the hive mind we have ever done.
Twitter.
And is it messy? Yeah. Is it messy? Also, Facebook to a degree. Is it messy? Is it weird? Is it gross? Is it all of these things? Yes, but that's what we are. We're looking to a degree at ourselves and not really liking what we see.
Yeah. Well, I guess time will tell with more research on it. I don't think Jack's going to shut down Twitter anytime soon and put an end to that. So
no.
And again, you can turn it off anytime you want. One of the things I've done is I now get the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, and the LA Times print. So I kind of flip through all of them. The stories are not so different,
Smart.
The straight news stories, but the op-eds are quite different. And it's a little bit like toggling back and forth between Fox News and CNN, which in the last couple of years, I mean, they've diverged so much that they could be talking about the same incident and you would have no idea they're talking about the same thing. And but just the very act of toggling back and forth and making people aware that, these are opinion editorials. These are not news. Hannity and Carlson and Laura Ingraham, that's not Fox News. That's their evening entertainment division. The news guys during the day, it's a very different perspective. And, there I think it's what your point is, that just being aware of all those different viewpoints on the same, discussing the same incidences makes you pause and go, okay, I'm going to split the difference, or, I'm going to reject both of them because they're both too extreme. Just that awareness, I think, helps, which is the point of your book, is diversity of viewpoint.
And that's Gary Kasparov's point about like what modern, propaganda, what modern disinformation campaigns is really about. It's not to actually get you to believe a particular thing. It's get you to be distrustful of everything. And Gary Kasparov wrote something really excellent about that, because I do think of disinformation and misinformation, particularly when it's malicious and it's hidden, is a genuine problem for the First Amendment. Like, how exactly do we deal with this? And I actually am in the camp where I think that can potentially be a real threat, because it generates things like, I don't believe anybody anymore, which is toxic to a pluralistic democracy.
Right. Well, maybe the solution then is reject the extremes of either side. Don't reject all search for truth. Just that, just your skeptical alarm should go off when somebody is, 3 standard deviations out from the mean of their position.
Right.
We're
what did you think about that research that I was reading lately that about rationalization and IQ, that essentially like smart people are even better at self-deception than anybody else?
I've been writing about that since my first book, Why People Believe Weird Things. And then
the
second edition.
And I have read basically all your books.
The second edition of that I did, Why Smart People Believe Weird Things, in part for what you just said. They're better at employing the confirmation bias and the hindsight bias and the me too my side bias and so on, because they're smart, they're clever, they're well read. They can construct logical arguments, at least in their head, seem plausible. So that's it in part. And also, well, here I'm a little conflicted. I've been reading Hugo Mercier's work. He has this new book out, Not Born Yesterday, and the previous book he did with Dan Sperber on, why we, to what extent we're rational versus actually rationalizing our team arguments. We don't search for truth.
This is going on the list.
Yeah.
What's the name of the book again?
Oh, well, so Hugo Mercier's new book is Not Born Yesterday. So
okay. Ordering.
He presents new research that pushes back against this power of social media, particularly like the Russian hacking of the 2016 election, first of all, almost nobody, very little of that online content was consumed. And the stuff that was consumed by the people on either side, it wasn't changing anybody's minds. It was just kind of reinforcing what they already believed. So, like the classic example I use is the Pizzagate Incident, which fueled this QAnon conspiracy. Well, if you believe that Hillary's running a pedophile ring out of a pizzeria, and I show you that it's not, I show you that it's not true. There's no basement at the pizzeria. Oh my God, there's no basement. Yeah, and then you go in there and there's no kids being molested or so on. That person is not going to go, in that case, I'm voting for Hillary, right? They already hate Hillary. Yeah. They're never voting for Hillary. It doesn't matter. Well, so that kind of...
And that's something... Oh, sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
And that's something that we that's something that we talk about in Catching Up with Coddling, in the update to it, is that how much of this is more perfect homophily, perfect sorting than anything else, because one theory on why depression goes up is not necessarily just the Mean Girls theory, but that 20 people who all like Depeche Mode's Darkest Stuff, suddenly find each other, and they collectively get more depressed. 20 people who like, I don't know, whoever the fun people are, get happier. That essentially some of this it's facilitated by social media. It's facilitated by homophily, but it's leading people who are already pretty far gone to be far goner.
Right.
But not necessarily change their mind.
Right. So Hugo's previous...
Oh, and by the way, I live close to that pizza place, and when I found out it was actually Cosmo's, I was like, "That's a delightful place."
That's too funny.
It's a great pizza place.
Are they still in business? Wasn't he having some trouble because no one wanted to go there?
I'm pretty sure they're still in business. They have ping pong, and really good DC pizza, which is not a contradiction anymore.
Yeah. So, and then related to Hugo's work is this other theory. Do we default to truth? That is, do we just believe people and then be skeptical, and that's harder? Or are we naturally skeptical and we don't just believe people? So Hugo's new argument in the new book kind of pushes back against this default to believing, default to truth, that in fact we default to skepticism. And this is why, he says, this is why most political advertising doesn't work. It's a complete waste of money. People have already made up their minds, and when politicians spend money on ads, they're really just sort of boosting the base, that they're not going to get new votes. This is what, he cites quite a bit of research in cognitive psychology and social psychology, to what extent people don't just fall for cult leaders and religious leaders and admin, commercials and things like that. That in fact, that cults are pretty rare. It's really hard to get people to just, give up their belongings and so on. And of course, the standout examples of, Heaven's Gate or Jonestown, they are, decades apart and very rare, and very few people join extreme groups like that. Of course, general religions like Catholicism or something like that are huge, but they're not cults, right? They're not, people aren't throwing away their homes and leaving their spouses and things like that to go to the evolutionary level above humans to the spaceship. Very few people do that. It takes a lot to make that happen. So I think this is one of those issues that is not settled yet. Malcolm Gladwell's latest book, Talking to Strangers, is all based on this theory that we just default to believing people. And I don't think that's true. I mean, Malcolm's good at plucking out anecdotes from history and then spinning them around like one study in social psychology. But the evidence, and there's tons of examples where people didn't believe Hitler, but they just didn't have a choice. One last point on that that he made me rethink this. How do you get a nation of Germans, educated, cultured, sophisticated people to become goose-stepping Nazis in a couple of years? How do you do that? And the answer is they didn't. They never had a majority in a democracy. They never got the majority of people to go along with National Socialism, particularly both the war and the eliminationist philosophy of National Socialism, which led to the Holocaust. Most Germans did not go along with that. But to your work, if you silence people through the press, you silence the media, you silence people's voices by threatening to put them in concentration camps if they speak out, there's no diversity of opinion anymore. And therefore, you get this kind of spiral of silence or this pluralistic ignorance where everybody thinks everybody else thinks a particular way because nobody can speak out. And that gets to your work on the importance of free press and free speech.
Yeah, my dad grew up in Yugoslavia, and he got kicked out of high school for opposing the Nazis. And one of his early memories was being told by the person who was in charge of the high school, "I have the lives of 120 boys to think of," which really brought it home because they would. I lived in the Czech Republic too, and it was the kind of thing that when they killed Heydrich, the Nazis wiped out like 11 towns.
Yes.
So like the kind of control they had over it. But one thing that my dad did bring to my understanding of how that was possible was how much they relied on the fear of the Soviets. How much that if there hadn't been this idea that there's this massive threat out there, it would have been a very he thinks an impossible thing to achieve.
Yeah. So that sort of points to the importance of your work on free speech, that, it once the press goes and people feel silenced. And on the left, this cancel culture, the silencing effect of people that just don't say anything. And maybe they're not canceled, but to your point of when Heydrich was assassinated and the Germans, lined up 50 people at a time and just randomly shot them, the effect that has is it silences everybody. Just keep your mouth shut, keep your head down, don't say anything. Right. So it's a much more tame example, but, in a classroom where students are afraid to speak out because they're afraid that they'll be canceled, that's a silencing effect. Yeah.
Well, and it's something that I really would like to sort of focus, universities back on. I call it the perfect rhetorical fortress when I refer to what universities have come up with. Now, to be clear, I think conservatives have a rhetorical fortress, and it basically just means you don't have to listen to liberals, experts, or the media, and that's pretty thorough just with those three steps. Right. But higher education has all this cognitive energy devoted to figuring out different ways to win arguments in dormitories, when I'm being dismissive to say it. But it's got layer after layer after layer. And the idea that it's not just if you disagree, you're wrong. It's that you're evil, which has which is not scholarly way to approach things. It actually, I think, borrows a little bit from superstition, almost. But it's not the kind of attitude we should be conveying to students entering a college. You're like the fact that people don't really talk as much about like the mindset you're supposed to have going into college is radically open-minded. If you want some of this stuff to work, and we're doing the exact opposite. We're kind of teaching them, well, these are your certainties.
Right.
This is the way we argue that doesn't require you to actually get to the substance of someone's argument. And now let's expand knowledge. It's fundamentally flawed from the get-go.
Right, and you and Jonathan point out, this kind of extreme politicization of the academy, where like 90% of the humanities are Democrats, and to what extent can a student possibly hear both perspectives? I mean, are you really going to get the conservative point of view? And I don't mean right. Trump or Hannity or Rush Limbaugh. I mean like a George Will. If you read George Will or Charles Krauthammer, these are really smart guys.
Or Thomas Sowell.
They really articulate great arguments. And if you're a liberal and you can't address those and counter them with your liberal arguments, then you're lost.
Yeah. Well, and I look at the way things are currently going in terms of the way people argue on Twitter, and you can get to see a lot of what's wrong with the way we're currently taught to argue. Because I mean, I'm a political liberal. I am liberal probably circa like 1983 or something like that. But I'm an old ACLU type, and it's amazing that that the way we argue on campus has become so ingrained that essentially when I was coming to the defense of free speech culture and in a debate, I realized what was happening in this debate was first of all, you don't have to listen to anyone who's conservative. So we got 50% of the population that right there. And the fact that Trump agrees with me on cancel culture also means it's against it. But I'm like, but also Obama agrees with me. And also like all those people who signed the Harper's letter agree with me and you agree with, and then that essentially you're getting like, wow, you've successfully gotten rid of about 75% of the entire population of the planet. Well done. Bravo. And within that 25%, they're scared as hell to actually say anything dissenting.
Right. Yeah. No. To my class, most of my students are pro-choice. They're liberal and they're pro-choice. I'm pro-choice. Mm-hmm. But when I ask them, what are the three best arguments that the pro-lifers have? They have no idea. Well, they hate women.
Wow.
They hate women or they hate babies. It's like, no, that's not one of their arguments. And so
we're both atheists, but I went to Catholic school, and I am like, listen, if you believe in an eternal soul and you believe it attaches at a certain point, like that, then, once you get that part through, it's like, oh, I get it then, I understand that perspective. If you believe in this assumption, I don't believe in that assumption.
Yeah.
But if you do, it's a point of view that is coherent.
Right. Yes, and they do have good arguments, really. And you don't even have to have the soul part. It can just be, when life begins or whatever, because scientists can't. There's no place where you have to draw the line somewhere. But, there's no obvious place to draw it, although the law has kind of migrated toward this sort of 20, 22, 24 weeks, and that seems about right. But, it's arbitrary to a certain extent. But to the larger point that, issues on immigration or taxation or foreign policy, all those are debatable. And when you read someone like a George Will or a Charles Krauthammer or Thomas Sowell, it's like, wow, those are great arguments. And, I really got to think through my position on those. But again, if you only hear this extreme versions on each side, it makes it hard to even understand what the other side is saying. Now, another thing I'm still conflicted about, too, that I wanted to ask you about, give us an update from Fire of how many cancellations, deplatformings there have been. I haven't looked at your data in maybe 2 years. And here's my larger point. I used, before COVID, I would give, maybe a dozen public talks at colleges and universities every year. And if you only watch Tucker Carlson's Campus Craziness episodes every week, you would think every campus in America is just going to hell in a handbasket. It's just chaos and riots and burning down Starbucks or whatever. But when you walk around campuses like I do, it's like there's nothing happening here. Yeah. It's peaceful. It's bucolic. Yeah. It's nice. So to what extent is this really a problem, or are we just getting the availability heuristic here, where we just see it on the news and that seems terrible?
It doesn't have to be in flames, though, to have a problem. And I think a sign of health as a First Amendment attorney is how bad the cases that are coming to you are. And what I mean by that is how offensive the cases are coming to you. So it's a sign of the success of freedom of speech and the First Amendment that within the law, we're dealing with things like Westboro Baptist Church, like someone who's so universally, horrifyingly, and correctly offensive to literally everybody.
Yeah.
When you reach the point where that's the issue and it's very clear that the law and the principle will come down the side of free speech, that means from a free speech perspective, your society is healthy. But like today, I just wrote a blog post for Eternally Radical Idea, just talking about this one little example. And I deal with, thousands of these, almost every year. We get about 1,000 case submissions at Fire defending, asking for people to help us with their free speech cases. But I have a case at Portland State University.
Wait, did you say 1,000?
Where an autistic...
Did you say 1,000?
We get 1,000 case submissions a year, yeah.
Whoa. Okay, well, that's disturbing. That's a lot.
Yeah, no, I mean, and it's really easy to say the wrong thing in precisely the place where it should be the most forgiving and the most kind of eager. So we had a case. It's actually not a case because the law is murky on it, to be frank. But I still thought it was wrong. So I decided to write about it. And it was Portland State University. An autistic student said that people were asking, like, how would you respond to the election? I think she was more conservative. And she said, but I'm not, I'm going to accept what the results are. I'm not a snowflake. And she was immediately cut off and kicked out of class until she agreed to not say derogatory things in class again. And it's like, okay, even if she wasn't autistic, I still think this is messed up. But you just told an autistic student that you have to get better with social cues or you can't actually get back into class is kind of messed up. And by the way, I talk about in this, we see cases from kids on the spectrum all the time, because when you create this many landmines, it's hard for international students, it's hard for people from different class backgrounds to kind of figure out how to navigate like the new small talk or whatever it is. Yeah. And for autistic students, that they come to fire a lot because they're like, I don't know how to do this. So good news is the student was admitted back to class. We just wrote about this, but I see stuff like this all the time where the standard is more like, are you kidding me? And that's a sign of an unhealthy free speech atmosphere in a place that should have the absolute most tolerance for people playing with ideas, engaging in devil's advocacy, kind of similar to the name of your book. These are how you get to better ideas. And if it's that easy to step on a landmine, how are you going to produce consistent, challenging ideas?
Yeah. Now, you can't invite everybody to speak to your campus. Maybe a college has maybe a dozen outside speakers come each year. So do you invite Milo Yiannopoulos versus a George Will or a Sean Hannity or if you have to pick and choose, kind of what's the criteria that a university might use? I mentioned Milo because he's kind of well known for being sort of a professional flamethrower, and his whole thing is, I'm going to poke the hornet's nest and get the snowflakes to blow up. And get the libtards to lose their minds. Okay, maybe I don't want that.
But there'd been people like that forever.
Right.
I mean, the thing that I feel like what I explain on campuses sometimes that I feel like nobody's actually taught them is that there are Nazi, white supremacist, KKK marches and rallies, all the time in the United States. And why don't you hear about them? Because everybody goes, those horrible people, that they don't work because we don't give them oxygen.
Right.
And so like there have been people making fun of political correctness coming to campuses before political correctness had a name, Right. Lenny Bruce used to like to do campuses, and he really loved to sort of test the limits, and the students were really down with that. So if you create a situation, and what was interesting, and I'm not a big, I'm no fan of Milo, but the I think he knows that, unfortunately. And I try not to play favorites in this stuff, so we feel bad. Actually, free speech for everybody. But role of the provocateur my point was better understood.
Yeah, Milo should be free to say anything he wants, anywhere he wants. He can start his own newsletter, have his own YouTube channel, whatever. Fine.
But if you have to choose,
yeah. I mean, should I? If I don't invite him to my campus and instead I invite whoever, I'm not squelching his free speech.
No. But if the students want to invite him and you say they can't, then you're squelching the students' free speech.
Okay, so that's a good criteria.
And it's interesting because like the disinvitation stuff we knew was going to shift depending on who gets invited in the first place. Well, one of the things we did, actually, you might not even know this, Michael. We started doing individual campus surveys on how free people feel to speak. We were able to work with this group, College Pulse, that creates representative panels of students on campuses. So for the first time in our experience, we're actually able to rank some schools according to how sort of how good the students themselves are reporting the campus to be. And I'm always suspicious of my own confirmation bias. And when something actually confirms to it too well, I actually get a little bit like, So I was a little bit like, we did 55 schools this year, and University of Chicago did come out as number one. We were a little bit like, okay, we almost didn't want that result because it seemed so clear. But Harvard ended up in the bottom 10.
Wow.
UT Austin,
really,
54th.
Wow.
Which was kind of a shock. I'd heard some things about UT Austin, but not 54th. Right. Yale did better than you'd think. I think Yale was like 12th. And we tried to figure out, like, is this an echo chamber effect that we're seeing here? That essentially, if you look at, for example, like if you look at when you ask students at Brown, if they're willing to, if they think they have a lot of free speech, the answers from the liberal students are extremely high. When you compare that against the answers from conservative students, you get a better sense of like how welcoming the school really is. So sometimes you can have sort of an echo chamber effect, which we tried to account for. But I'm really excited about going deeper in that stuff now that we have the capacity to actually see, where students say there's a problem. And this partially came out from me going to Haverford College outside of Pennsylvania. And anytime students could get me in a situation where they felt like their friends weren't listening, they were like, yeah, everyone's just given up. Like, your life will be ruined if you say the wrong thing here.
Right.
The social stigma is not worth it. Just shut up. And I was like, it freaked me out because I'd been going to a lot more state schools for a couple of months before that, for what, just how this, for whatever reason, I was doing a lot more kind of more working class schools. And there, the problems are kind of, like old fire, where it's an administrator throwing their weight around or being a jerk or these kind of typical controversies for decades. It's more on the elite colleges that we see some of the real kind of like doctrinaire kind of enforcement.
Yeah, so there's First Amendment issues to what extent the government can silence people's speech. But then there's the stuff you've just been talking about, to what extent maybe college administrators or students silence each other's speech or that of speakers through deplatforming and protests. But what about in the corporate world? I mean, you're not free to say anything you want in a corporation. I can't just tell some female employee you got a nice ass without expecting to have some ramifications. Or if I'm the boss and the employer, at the McDonald's window or whatever is talking about Trump is Hitler or Biden is Stalin, I'm going to silence them. I'm going to say, look, you got to shut up. Keep your political beliefs to yourself. That's not what we do here. That's not really, that's not a free speech issue in the traditional sense, but it is silencing people, but for legitimate reasons, perhaps.
Yeah, I have the luxury now that I've been with FIRE since 2001, and we've had these kind of successful kind of side projects. I'm able to talk more about not just the free speech law and First Amendment law and history, but also talk about free speech culture. And sometimes this really angers lawyers because it's not as cut and dry. So sometimes when someone gets canceled, like they lose their job, they get kicked out of a newspaper. I have no problem saying I think that was the wrong call. And that doesn't mean there are people on Twitter who are like, they have every legal right to do it. I'm like, just because it was legally. So I was very critical, for example, of the firing of James Bennett. And James Bennett was, very explicitly, from everything I could see, added to the New York Times in 2016 because there was a crisis of confidence among the New York Times that, wow, if Trump could be elected, we must be out of touch with the rest of the United States. And the idea that he and one of the people he hired, Barry Weiss, specifically to address that sort of like lack of perception, like he ended up getting ousted after all the sort of pressure that he was nasty. I thought that was a very sad sign for free speech culture. Legally, could they do it? Of course they could legally do it. Do I think it's healthy for the state of our democracy? Not so much.
Yeah, but they were brought, yes, I agree with you, but they were brought in specifically to speak about politics on that particular side. So it's weird that they would then be fired for doing what they were hired to do. But again, back to my previous point, I guess, on like corporations, it depends on who's doing the talking. We all self-censor. I mean, I don't just walk around blurting out everything I think, and that's a good thing. Not even to my spouse. Sometimes you should just keep your mouth shut, and there's a time and a place for everything. Or, I'm an atheist, but I rarely hammer my religious friends about God and stuff because, it's just, don't be a dick about it, And so you might say I'm self-censoring, but it's not a free speech issue. I could. But there's consequences to my saying something that could cause problems or hurt feelings, and I don't want to do that. And that's a separate than a legal issue.
And that's the whole thing about cancel culture is it's murky, partially because you're saying that we've overdone it. And what worries me about like the cancel culture is just this idea that someone who you really dislike who has a awful opinion in there used to be a little bit more of a live and let live idea that, just because this person has horrifying ideas doesn't mean they can't be a good journalist or doesn't mean they can't be a good, teacher if it's not related to what they're teaching. And I think that if there's already a lot of conformity in a lot of institutions when it comes to ideology, and to like the James Damore thing, that was concerning. Like the idea that someone could make an argument that was largely pretty coherent and pretty based in and that was a step too far for Google, doesn't show a necessarily very healthy atmosphere for the dissent and back and forth that particularly tech industries probably need.
Yeah, I agree with you on that, and I'm sympathetic to James Damore, and I like him. But back to the corporate environment and rules. Was that his job to do that? I think it was okay because they asked people to submit opinions, right? So that it was wrong then to fire him for doing what they said it was okay to do. But that's not his job as a programmer to write treatises on gender differences and cognitive abilities.
No. Yeah, and to be clear, can they fire him? Yeah. Sure, they can. Do I think it was, do I disagree with the decision to fire him? I also do. And that's what I mean by when you get into the squishier cultural things, there's going to have to be judgment calls. And in some cases, a particular situation might bother you more than others. Yeah. Will that get you accused of bias to a degree? Sure, but that's also judgment. And I mean, like the idea that there's no judgment calls embedded into First Amendment law, for example, there's plenty of judgment calls embedded into, and ideas of free speech culture embedded into the law.
Let's talk about your new movie. I watched it. It was great.
Sure.
Give us a little bit of background on why you decided to make this film and what it's all about.
This is super exciting. It's called The Mighty Ira, and it's about Ira Glassner, who a lot of times people think it's about Ira Glass. Ira Glassner was the head of the ACLU from 1979 to 2001, and before that he was the head of the New York Civil Liberties Union, the NYCLU, which is their most important affiliate. And he's for what I do. He's a giant. Ira Glassner was someone who was willing to explain to people why you should even defend the rights of Nazis to free speech. But he also practiced what he preached. He was willing to go on and debate with William F. Buckley, go on his show, be a happy warrior, defending people who not just he hated, but who hated him, had no issue doing it. And it's a movie about his life and times. Where it came from is actually very cool. I definitely try to see within my own organization who's got like a project that they're really excited and animated about, because that's oftentimes how you get your best stuff. And Nico Perino, our VP of communications, he's just been innovating, nonstop. And he did a podcast. He just interviewed Ira Glassner, and he's like, "This is amazing. Like this is great stories." So I gave him the green light to take our video staff, who are also amazing, and go and work on a documentary. And the thing he produced at the end, I'm like, "Good Lord, this is an excellent documentary." And I want to find that kind of stuff and encourage more of it, because I think. I think when you're defending a culture of free speech, you got to think creatively, and I think that this one reminds people of why people were willing to defend the Nazis at Skokie, but what a previous generation of free speech defender looked like, and what they were able to accomplish, and how rich and interesting their life actually were.
Yeah, the film clips from him and William F. Buckley, who I always love because he's so damn entertaining, even though I disagreed with so many of his views. But Ira really held his own against Buckley, which is no small thing to do. It was fun. And but also watching your film kind of reminded me of how far we've come, how far you free speech warriors, how the progress we've made in large part thanks to Ira's work over the decades. It happens just slowly enough that you don't notice it, and then all of a sudden something happens. It's like, hey, that's my free speech right. It's like, well, it didn't used to be, and it wasn't that long ago that it wasn't. Yeah. And here I'm thinking of where Buckley, and this is a larger point, that it used to be the conservatives who always wanted to silence people or squelch speech or whatever. Yeah. Like rock, remember when rock lyrics were leading to sex, drugs, and rock and roll, and this is satanic forces, and it was the rockers who had to defend themselves against these conservatives like William F. Buckley and others who would say, no, this is that kind of freedom of expression, flag burning or protesting or even just rock music, somehow degrades the morals of society. It's a clear and present danger in that original phrase. And therefore, it's okay to silence people. And it was people like Ira that stood up and said, no, and here's why. And he articulated that.
And that's why I call it censorship gravity. Basically, like I'm trying to explain some of these concepts to a younger generation. So I'm trying to come up with terms for things that are very clear when you study this, and you're obviously going to recognize this too. Is that what's normal in human society? Tribalism, is a primary state where there's a big emphasis on conformity. Tolerance, which comes later and is commendable to a degree, but that's more or less saying it's like I hate you, I hate what you believe, but I can break bread with you potentially, but preferably live over there. The really eternally radical idea is not only am I going to tolerate these dissenters, I'm going to listen to them, and I'm going to keep in mind always the possibility that I'd be wrong. That is a very difficult and for some people unpleasant mental state to maintain. And law and psychology and self-interest, it all tends to pull us back. So it's not a surprise that sometimes conservatives and liberals shift places on what they think about free speech. And particularly, the more power, the more in charge you are of an institution, there's the temptation. I'm trying to actually figure out the name for this. Like John Adams, signer of the Declaration of Independence, signer, like second president, presumably really good on free speech. How did he become the guy who immediately adopted the Alien and Sedition Act? The temptation to censor is just always present, and you just have to get up every day and say, listen, I know that this doesn't come naturally to us. I know that we prefer certainty and conformity. Some part of a lot of us really would prefer that, but this is what I believe ultimately is a better way, and it's not easy.
Yeah, well, Lincoln suspended the writ of habeas corpus during the Civil War, and President Wilson discriminated against well, he was a racist already, but against German Americans.
Don't get me started on Wilson. He's where all modern First Amendment law comes from, the Espionage Acts, and how they were going after people. There's a wonderful line, I think, in a book talking about how they put Debs in prison for having the temerity to say that your lives are worth, you shouldn't be cannon fodder.
Right. Well, I wrote about the Schenck versus the United States case at the beginning of Giving the Devil His Due, because, what was Schenck doing? He was handing out flyers protesting the draft. That
poor political speech.
Right. That's a clear and present danger.
And making a 13th Amendment argument, too.
Right. Which, in the United States of America, we have to make these counter arguments to those kind of things. Yeah, there is something in the human psychology about once you have power, once you're in charge, it's a game changer. So I want to ask about Snowden.
It's much too tempting.
Yeah, even Obama, Mr. Transparency, and I very much like Obama, but obviously a smart guy, and he seemed like a big free speech guy and so forth, very tolerant. But the moment he got power, and then all the surveillance and why didn't he forgive Snowden? Why hasn't Trump forgiven Snowden and brought him back? I mean, what are your thoughts on Snowden?
Well, on Snowden, I'm a little mixed. I'm kind of with Jelani Cobb a little bit on this, but I haven't come to a final conclusion. Oh, he's a writer for the New Yorker who we disagree, but I actually admire a great deal. My biggest beef with Obama, and by the way, Obama's been great on cancel culture. He's been great on a lot of the sort of like illiberal tendencies of the kind of far left or the campus left, but my greatest disappointment was what happened with the Department of Education under Obama. And that the Department of Education under Obama came out with some rules regarding people accused of harassment and also sexual assault that really limited their due process rights. But worse, frankly, in my opinion, was the fact that the Department of Education also came up with these incredibly, laughably broad definitions of harassment that, once again, just like campuses had tried in the 80s, transforms what's supposed to be a harassment code about a pattern of behavior into something that, if you take it literally, would give you carte blanche to stop anyone that you could claim you found offensive, which is basically everybody. And it's a shame because, I voted for Biden, but Biden, I'm afraid he's going to reinstitute. So I voted for someone that I know is actually probably going to make my life harder if they reinstitute a lot of these bad Department of Education policies. I hope they won't, partially because they kept on getting defeated in court, which is probably somewhat a pretty good persuasive way to say, like, listen, things are different than 2012. But we'll see. To be in democracy, is to constantly be disappointed and be okay with that.
If the Republicans retain the Senate Could they block those kinds of attempts by Biden, or can he do it unilaterally without their approval?
Given it's the Department of Education, his Department of Education could do that without his approval. Although actually there are some limitations on it that would be harder to overcome. It depends specifically on which reform you're talking about.
Yeah.
But we actually, I have obviously have my criticisms with Trump. I'm horrified that he hasn't conceded the election yet, because I think that's really irresponsible. But at the same time, the DeVos and the Department of Education, for all of the hate she got, made some really good improvements for both due process and free speech.
Right. Yeah, well, the day we're recording this, it still hasn't been settled. Hopefully by the time we release this, it will be, but maybe not. But
yeah,
the other thing that's mystified me to the larger point of your work is the bafflement by liberals to not understand why so many people voted for Trump. And it's not hard to understand if you just ask them. Why are you I have lots of conservative friends. A bunch of my cycling buddies are conservative. We're out there for 2-3 hours a day riding our bikes, talking about everything. How could you possibly support Trump? And they tell me. It's like, okay, I get it. And a few weeks ago, I was did a debate with Dinesh D'Souza, who's a big Trump supporter, and at a church in Michigan, a Christian Lutheran church, right? So they're all Trump supporters. So I just asked them point blank, you guys are Christians. You're supposed to be the party of morals and principles. And how can you put up this guy and support him? 3 wives and multiple mistresses and cheating on and fraud and the fake university. You just list 100 things in 5 minutes. And the response was, well, first of all, we're not hiring a role model. We don't care what he does personally. Second, he's pro-life, and we've been asking for a pro-life candidate on the Republican side forever. And the most, Dinesh made this point, the most anybody like Reagan or Bush, Romney, they just throw us a little bone. Like, I'm pro-life, but they don't do anything about it. They said, look, Trump is actually doing something about it. Judges, appointment of conservative judges, 3 justices, standing up to the, cancel culture and the snowflakes and the political correctness. They'd rattle it off. When you listen to it, you go, okay, all right, I get it. Well, I'm not convinced personally, but I get it.
From the other perspective, like seeing it from kind of like what I deal with on campus, to see people throwing up their hands saying like, I can't believe, white women aren't voting for us and white men aren't voting for us. And it's like, so let's phrase this in terms of like what's coming from some of the worst activists. The people that you make fun of all the time and that you discount as a group and say are responsible basically for all human evil forever. Yeah, it's a real shock that they don't want to vote for your guy.
Right. But, to the free speech, if you just talk to other people on the other side with a mind open enough to just at least hear what they're arguing and then be able to repeat it, the steel manning, just say, so let me get this straight. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. These are the 5 reasons you support Trump. Yes. Okay, I got it. Then it makes sense, even though you don't have to be personally convinced of it.
Well, but what you're doing is actually takes more work than it used to, because as you well know, we're more physically segregated from people we disagree with. We're more physically segregated by class, but also that's one of the contributions of social media. Since Facebook kind of pats you on the back for having an echo chamber to a degree, but Twitter even more so. The nasty dismissive thing takes off more. It takes effort to actually go out and listen to people, because the people you're surrounded by increasingly in American society, tend to amplify rather than inject that suitable, sensible doubt that is so empowering.
Yeah. Well, Greg, I know you have a hard out in a minute for another interview because you're doing not a book tour, I guess a film tour. How's that? You're walking on the red carpet. Well, everybody knows where they can get your book, The Coddling of the American Mind, on Amazon and so forth. Where can they watch the Mighty Ira, which I highly recommend? It's a great film.
It's easy to find now. It's on iTunes. I think it's on Netflix or it's on Prime at least. If you just do a search for Mighty Ira, you'll find all sorts of ways you can watch it. And I gotta really emphasize, I am so proud of how that movie came out.
Yeah, it's really a moving film. What's next?
Oh, goodness. I mean, my promise to my staff is I'm not writing another book again until 2022. I'm not even going to decide what it is. Okay. So a lot of my focus right now is longer form arguments in the blog. So Eternally Radical Idea right now is kind of my passion. to explain some of these really simple philosophical ideas, but try to make them as clear as possible. Working on a comic book on freedom of speech.
Oh, right.
We already have one. We already wrote one, but I'm trying to make one that's more sort of superhero-y. And there are some possibilities to do additional films with Ted Balaker. But as far as the single thing I'm the most excited about really expanding, it's that going deeper into the data and going deeper into how we rank schools for free speech. Because you're absolutely right. Some schools you go to and it's like they're doing great. They're doing absolutely fine by free speech.
Right.
You know, they cost too much, but nothing to see here at this particular school. But others are kind of a mess, and we would love to be able to tell students much more conclusively, you know, like we can now. And forgive me for Syracuse alums you have, but right now we've just seen so many bad cases out of Syracuse. We're like, don't go to Syracuse.
Really?
And I'd like to be able to say that much more. Yeah, it's a shock and a disappointment given that they have a free speech center there and they have the First Amendment written on a building. That they've been such a consistent disappointment on free speech.
Well, maybe
issues.
your work will get a category added to the U.S. News and World Report rankings of the top 500 universities. Where are they on this category right here? Because that's important.
That would be great.
Well,
moving the needle just a little bit on that can make a big difference.
That's all we can hope to do. Greg, thank you so much for coming on the show. Thanks for your work, more importantly, and now you're a filmmaker. It's great. You know, we're
actually the first one was Can't We Take a Joke? This is my second time as a producer, which is
That's right.
I'm really proud of that too. We're thinking about making sort of an update because we were talking about cancel culture and its devastation to comedy back in 2015, and if anything, we were too ahead of the curve on that.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, when Jerry Seinfeld won't come to your campus, you know you've gone too far.
Yeah, exactly. Anyway, real pleasure, Michael.
Thanks,
Great
Greg.
chatting with you.